Hey, David Bucky. Glad you're here. I thought that was really pretty cute. I found that right before we were gonna be here together. So let's just put the sacred stone, aka meteorite, right there so everybody can see. And of course, the scarab. You can see me. I'm right here. My name is Suze or Sophia, whatever makes your boat float. Now, today, I felt like I really wasn't into history. And there's a book that's been in my library forever, and it's called Principles of Spiritual Science by Carl Unger. And first off, I just have to say that one of my friends in grade school, his name was Carl Unger, spelled the same way, no doubt. And there was also a Randy Unger that I went to Gibson Elementary with. But, right inside here, and I want to show you guys, these books all come out of the Library of Magdalena House. And let me put that stamp up there. All my Steiner books came out of the same library. It's a very interesting story, and I've told it once, but someday we'll get back into it. This is from the Anthroposophic Press, Spring Valley, New York. The copyright is 1976, and it's printed here in America. So it's one of the newer books, but it's not written by Steiner. And all I can say before I begin to read this book to you guys, it's not that long. It's only 80 pages. But I can remember before I left my old life, I took this book and locked myself in one of the kids' bedrooms so I didn't have to talk to anybody. I was really in a very contemplative state of mind. And I read this book back in 2006. Haven't read it since. I had the place marked. Didn't figure I pulled it out. I wanted to start with something I thought was interesting. So what we're doing is we're jumping to page 74. And this is what Carl has to say. Okay, so of course we know our animal nature is inward to man, a principle inward to the animal. The essential thing indicated thereby is rightly designated as causality, a principle inward to the animal. The animal overcomes time and space through causality. Thus, we can term the animal a five-dimensional being in the same sense that a plant is a four-dimensional one. The new contradiction that we must incorporate with our thought is shown by this, that when dealing with the animal, even the concepts of becoming no longer suffice us. We need a kind of logic of inwardness, of causality, psychology. Thus, we can propound the following axioms. Logic of the three dimensions. Every concept excludes what is other than it. Logic of the four dimensions. Every concept includes what is other than it. Logic of the five dimensions. Every concept acts by what is other than it. The three-dimensional beings point us towards the concept of the this besides that, the fourth dimensional, towards the one of one after another, the fifth dimensional ones, towards that of this because that. Okay, so let's pick it up with the foreword. Anthroposophy, or spiritual science, which comprises Rudolf Steiner's researches into the supersensible nature of man and the world, is based on carefully worked out theory of knowledge. This is developed in Steiner's early philosophical works, and notably in his philosophy of freedom. As his archives increased, however, and the significance of spiritual science for all departments of knowledge and cultural became apparent, it was not possible even for Steiner, with the time at his disposal, to follow each one up in detail. Wherever possible, he found collaborators who could do this for him. Carl Unger, 1878 to 1929, was one of these collaborators. It was to him that Steiner gave the task of working out the spiritual scientific theory of knowledge further. This little volume, though not the only work from Unger's hand, is the essence of what he did in this field. It is not everybody's book, nor even for those who decide to take it up, an easy book. Each sentence builds closely on all that precede it. Each is essential to all that follow. For those students, however, who seek a secure foundation in pure thought for the supersensible realities of which Steiner speaks, and are willing to give it the study it deserves, this book will be a continuing reward and delight. It is not disparaging to Steiner, nor indulging in disproportionate adulation of Unger to say that Carl Unger has given in this book what only Steiner might have done as well, and perhaps not even he better. And that foreword was written by Alan Howard. In Chapter 1, The Ego and the Nature of Man. There is a method of presenting the theories of spiritual science or of anthroposophy, which in a certain sense involves an utter reversal of all we are used to in the description of these theories. Epistemological is the name we shall give this method of exposition, because it forces the student of this wisdom back onto his own principles of knowledge. On the other hand, such a method of exposition can also be of use in showing how a self-consistent theory of knowledge, which is commonly practiced today, has little help to give to philosophic needs, can yet be highly fruitful and positive for human knowledge, and is by no means forced to stay in those fetters that have been riveted upon it in the present stage of spiritual life. Moreover, an epistemology of this kind has no need to restrict itself to setting forth the forms of cognition, but it holds a distinctive and essential content of its own, which shows how near philosophic reflection, if only it keep true to itself, comes to the teachings of spiritual science. It is but natural that the manner of presenting his doctrines, as given by the spiritual investigator, would also be retained by those who make those doctrines the subject of their own researches, or whose task is to propagate them. But it is precisely when we feel the need of adapting for life, to the best of our powers, the teachings that have been entrusted to us, that we cannot but be struck by the fact that the message of the spiritual investigator is garbed in quite definite form, that his experiences in higher worlds are not communicated as they were experienced. Rather, a sharp distinction is drawn by the spiritual investigator between descriptions of the experiencing of the higher worlds and what is communicated as truth, as doctrine concerning the world and man. This quite definite form addresses itself to our understanding. It joins on to what we already know or ought to know. The spiritual investigator makes use of our own cognitive forms of thought as the garb for his experiences. That, however, presupposes that we should know and command our own forms of cognition, and that we should also be convinced of their being fitted to apprehend reality. The fact of that presumption does not enter our consciousness so long as we are dealing with the simpler departments of spiritual science, where we can still link up with our own familiar experiences. But the further the investigation of which the results are communicated to us by the spiritual investigator advances into higher realms of being, the greater is the lack of epistemological certainty that we discover in ourselves. We feel as though an ever more insistent call and admonition were addresses to us, where the spiritual investigator, in those loftier expositions, is linked or is obliged to link up with the finer threads of the cognitive faculty in order to be understood by us. We are only able to follow the spiritual investigator with our own understanding into the heights of spiritual investigation when we have realized the certain presence of the Spirit in ourselves. What we must set before ourselves as our first goal is to understand the reality of spirit. Man terms his own spiritual nature the ego, and it is at once clear to our minds that all knowledge, all search for reality, is most intimately bound up with the ego. In spiritual science, we learn to know the ego as the fourth member of the human being. We are taught that man consists of the physical body, which contains all mineral properties, of the etheric body, which carries the plant properties, such as growth, nutrition, procreation, of the astral body, which carries the animal properties of instincts, desires, passions, etc., and of the ego, which raises man above the beast and assigns him to a kingdom of his own. When we learn to know the ego in this manner, we run the risk of contemplating it from without, as it were, of regarding it perhaps like the other, lower members of the human nature, as a kind of body. In so doing, we are taking our stand over against the ego as if it were another thing in the outside world. but nothing could be more mistaken than this. Above all, the spiritual investigator is deeply concerned to show that the ego is the core of man's being, which for that very reason cannot be described from without, but must be inwardly apprehended by each individual. This is brought home to us when we are made aware that the word I signifies a name that, when it reaches our ear from outside, can never refer to ourselves. Anyone can say table of a table, but a man can only say I of himself. Yet, we are open to the danger above described, which never allows us fully to apprehend what is spiritual. This is due to the fact that when other members are being described to us, we are already really presumed to have inwardly apprehended our ego, for an appeal is made to our powers of knowledge that, in fact, achieve their unfoldment through the ego, uniting with the object of cognition. This can be stated as a general truth. When, therefore, we are guided by the spiritual investigator through the members of man's essentiality up to the ego, the necessity may dawn upon us as we contemplate the first ego, or contemplate the ego first of all, of apprehending that ego itself, which had been presupposed on our journey. This cannot then but lead to epistemological reflections that must begin with this very ego, and thus arises the seeming reversal of which something was said at the beginning. The spiritual investigator links on to what we already know and leads us to the ego. Our knowledge, however, is bound up precisely with the ego and must start from it. It cannot be our present task to furnish a detailed theory of knowledge. We merely propose to point out a few main principles. All cognition proceeds as between the ego and what we may comprehensively term the non-ego. The ego seeks the reality of the non-ego, and in doing so, presupposes its own reality. This, however, is only feasible if the ego is capable of apprehending its own reality. That is the main task confronting the theory of knowledge. Hence, we can also formulate the task of the theory of knowledge by the question, what is reality? In so doing, we must bear in mind that the ego can find reality, and therewith the foundation of all knowledge, only in itself. If we would really attempt to apprehend the ego in its abstract purity, we must ask ourselves whereby precisely the ego is, as such, distinguished from the non-ego. In the first place, by nothing else but that which others object to, are distinguished from one another by judgment or thought. Now, thought, of course, is not the only so-called content of the ego, but still, the ego itself grows conscious of all that can fill it up in the shape of sensations, feelings, impulses of the will, and the like, only through the mental images and concepts connected with them. That is to say, through thought. Through all that fills the ego, thought is linked with the non-ego, from which it is perceived its stimulus. Only through the mental images and concepts therewith connected does the ego establish its own relationship to itself. Thought first makes the ego to be the ego. All other properties establish relations between ego and non-ego. Thought establishes the relation of the ego to itself. Hence, we shall be able to apprehend the ego, the prime reflective, which we let the force, in virtue of which the ego is distinguished from all else, turns back upon itself. That is to say, we must envisage thought as it is after abstraction has been made of all that we have called non-ego. Thought about thought. That is the formula that states the fact that the ego is concerned only with its own essence. Thought about thought. This is the point upon which hinges the epistemological section of Rudolf Steiner's philosophy of freedom, of which the other thoughts expressed above contain an echo. In that book, the unique significance of this formula for knowledge is for the first time pointed out, and our reflections that, despite their inner kinship, follow different paths show us how impossible it is to answer epistemological questions without starting from that formula. Now, what is left as thought only concerns itself with thought, that is to say, if the ego disregards everything that protrudes from the non-ego into the ego, there is nothing save the forms of thought, all those laws and properties that we enunciate in logic. This we may be comprehensively term the world of pure thought. When the ego lives in pure thought, then it is alone with its most innermost being. Indeed, we can designate as the pure ego what lives in thought above thought. In thought above thought, we have the sum of what is purest essence of ego. The formula, thought about thought, or more accurately, thought of thought, contains, however, another thing of the utmost significance. In all else that we can fill consciousness, we have to distinguish between the content proper and the form in which the content presents itself. In the thought of thought, we have apprehended the only point where both coincide. The thought that forms the content is the same as the thought applied to it. The forms take their course precisely according to the rules that make up the content. But that is exactly what we are seeking, for here we have a content that is upheld by its own form, or a form that has its own essence for content. Here, surely, we have something that exists through itself, that is dependent upon nothing else. Therewith, we have developed a concept that we can designate by a name, usually applied to every kind of thing, except the one for which it is above all fitted, that is, reality. We can call reality only what exists through itself and through nothing else. Reality must emerge when thought is focused upon itself. We must now ask ourselves what it is that in pure thought emerges as reality. Thought above thoughts yield, in the first place, the laws of logic. They, of course, are not reality. Reality can only be something in which all that is highest and purest in pure thought is gathered into one point, comprising in itself everything that can be called pure thought. In all the discussions of logic, it is true, thought moves in its own domain, but it does so at any one time only with a part of itself, as it were. The sum of all it is, that is what the reality of thought about thought must needs be. We can find such a point once we proceed to make a simple analysis of thought. In doing so, we can adhere to the course of logic theory as universally presented. Only we must keep in view what is essential. Logic starts from the classification of concepts, then goes on to combine the concepts into judgments, and then to unite the judgments into conclusions. Now, a simple act of reflection shows us that all thought proceeds entirely by way of concepts. Since conclusions are made up of judgments, it is sufficient for us to show that judgments are wholly made up of concepts. Let us just take a simple judgment. Man is mortal. Here we have first the subjective concept man and the predicative concept mortal. Both are linked together by the so-called copula is. That little word expresses the fact that of two concepts, one can be a subjective and other a predicative concept. If we now look closely into the matter, that too is a quite definite concept, which we might designate by one word as predictiveness. It is a concept that finds expression in all judgments. Thus, all combinations of concepts or even of judgments are again quite definite concepts. In this way, we have so narrowed down thought about thought that we no longer have to deal with anything save concepts. But the individual concepts are different. Their differentiation, indeed, is precisely what we are taught in the conceptual theory of logic. The important thing for us is that the concepts have varying degrees of purity. Thus, for instance, the predicative concept is always purer than the subjective concept in a judgment, for it is precisely the meaning of judgment that the relatively less pure subjective concept shall be clarified in the purity of the predicative concept. It is, however, our task to find the point in pure thought that draws together all particulars. But this must be a concept, since thought proceeds only by way of concepts. It must be the highest and purest concept, comprising in itself all that is conceptual. We can express such a concept, and it represents the highest elaboration of thought, the highest abstraction, but at the same time comprises in itself all pure thought. It is the concept of the concept. Now, what is it that this formula expresses? We must be clear in our minds that the concept as form always comprehends what may vary as content. Thus, the concept chair comprehends all the possible forms a chair may assume. It follows that in the same way the concept of a concept must, as form, comprehend all that, as conceptual content, may vary. It is, therefore, the sum and substance of all the potentialities of thought, or the thinking faculty. But nonetheless, there remains a difference between the formula, concept of the concept, and thinking faculty, as will be seen still more clearly later on. Whereas the faculty is something like a form, which may also remain empty, the concept of the concept presupposes the use of that faculty until, in its highest development, it has its innermost essence for content. It is like the starting point at the end of a circle, which actually coincide. In that case, we have in that highest abstraction precisely what we get when we strip the ego of all that derives from the non-ego. Hence, the concept of the concept is the pure ego. We see at once that we have concentrated in this formula, concept of the concept, all that we were able to say about thought after thought. Here, too, we have a form that has its own essence for content, a content that is carried by its own form. The concept of the concept, or the pure ego, is the reality that emerges in the course of thinking about thought. The pure ego is reality. It is remarkable that we have found reality in the highest abstraction, but by our path we have also carried out the Rosicrucian tenet, which, as the starting point of the Rosicrucian ascent to higher stages of being, has once more been made accessible to us by spiritual science. It states, "In pure thought thou findest the self, which can maintain itself." We have found a fixed point, a beginning of understanding, a reality, and at the same time the standard for all that we are seeking as understanding of reality. Reality is what exists through itself and through nothing else. This standard is taken out of the reality of the ego, which apprehends itself, and with it we can now address ourselves to what comes to us from the non-ego, that is, to what we may call observation in every form. First, however, we have yet to elaborate a few concepts that will show us how near we have come to certain fundamental doctrines of spiritual science. We must not shrink from such elaborations, much as we must generally beware of empty conceptual molds. For here we link on to a primal concept that is most living reality, which we must positively designate as a being, to the pure ego. We said at the beginning that all cognition proceeds as between ego and non-ego. The ego seeks the reality of the non-ego by presupposing its own reality. Now that we have found that the ego can, in fact, itself apprehend its own reality, it appears wholly permissible to attempt such a path to knowledge where the ego extends its own standard of reality to the non-ego. Actually, all knowledge that is accessible to us, and this includes all scientific knowledge, follows this path, although, as we shall see, a far deeper justification can still be given to it that it is commonly done. But we must by no means assume that this is the only pathway to knowledge. If knowledge is to establish a relation between two factors, ego and non-ego, then it can only be one of several possibilities if the one factor takes up a preferential position as compared with the other, and that the standard for that other is taken from it. In all thought constructions, it is of the greatest importance that the most complete harmony should always prevail between all the notes that are surrounded. The avoidance of any one-sidedness is the first prerequisite if reflections in the sphere of thought are to lead to a complete result. Thus, we must at least envisage the possibility that there may be a cognition in which the other factors, in its turn, plays a predominant part, where reality is not determined according to the standard of the ego, but the non-ego. Okay, good. I'm glad you find the book interesting, and drive safely to pick up the kids. Okay, now, in the meantime, let me pull up a little video so I can take a minute break reading and let Rex out to go to the bathroom. He's really good. He'll stand and wait, which I have to appreciate. Okay. Here we have The Science of Love. It's a Queen parody. It's a cappella science. And it is recommended for me. Now, the video that we started out with was published 3 years ago, and it's on a channel called Lou Co. Lou, capital Ko. And that was We Don't Believe in Science, the parody song. Okay, The Science of Love, Queen parody.
Show me the science of anybody show me science love. We'll work hard, oscillate in the night, share enzymes and microbiomes, and we'll bond with our super-synapse oxytocin attachment to orgasm without orgasm and circular and supranuclear. Somebody, let anybody show me the science of love. Every day, my drive's a biology grind. Evolution every hand-me-down that says, go make babies. Because together perfect your DNA. And the other sex, we find gametes and raise from the knee. Go, 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 go.
Is that a kazoo?
Somebody, anybody, show me show me the science of love. Comfort me with sweet dopamine. The Petron take the job. I'm alright. He's alright. He's alright. I've done all the requisite reading now. Someday I'll test the theory. The science of love, show me 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 the science of love. Somebody, show me the science of love. Anybody, show me the science of love. Show me the science of love. Show me the science
Excellent. Do.
Hey there, musical scientists. Hope you enjoyed my return to the roots, as it were, of a cappella science. If you like this video, I don't know, maybe send it to a nerd you like, and together you can get the old oxytocin flowing.
How about under the Fair Use Act, I just share it with the world?
As sung by a biologist. And
I mean, we're educating people on the science of love.
Bohemian Gravity. Speaking of which, Bohemian Gravity posters are still available on DFTV Records, and you can buy this MP3 and all my others on iTunes and Bandcamp. And of course, a big shout out and thank you to these people, as well as all of my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to keep me making musical science videos, consider going to patreon.com/acapellascience and supporting me. And of course, subscribe for monthly acapella science content. That's right, I'm doing a video a month this year. It's going to be a lot of work, but I'm really excited. So you'll be seeing me again real soon. Until then, my name is Tim Blay, and you're watching Acapella Science. Acapella Science.
Let me try to give you the other side of the stone. It's a little harder to balance. Acapella Science. Excellent. Okay. Let's get back to our book. We must also ever grant the possibility of a third kind of knowledge in which neither of the factors predominates, so that the knowledge comes about through mutual penetration. Both cases are for us no more than a possibility of thought, but only until we find ourselves faced with the results of a knowledge so constituted. Then we may be positively be led to an acknowledgement of such results if we have previously discovered in thought the possibility of such knowledge. Now, such results are actually to be found. This more especially is the nature of spiritual science. Now, such results are actually to be found. This more especially is the nature of spiritual science. That its knowledge is gained in a different way from our ordinary knowledge. We are shown how all of man's relations take on another form as we rise to higher stages of existence. There, things no longer confront man in sharp separation, so that, by contrast, he feels himself with them as a being apart. The ego extends its domain so as to include things. It feels itself united with them in a kind of inward equilibrium. Things begin to reveal their inwardness to the clairvoyant, so that he can feel with them as with beings of his own kind. This description that spiritual science furthers us of that stage of knowledge fully agrees with the case we found to be possible, where ego and non-ego are in equilibrium. That stage is known as imaginative knowledge. The third stage is described to us by the spiritual investigator as follows. He says that man begins to creep into things, as it were. He no longer stands over against them. He experiences them in their inner being. And a complete reversal takes place of the revelation known to us between ego and non-ego. It is the stage of inspired knowledge, as it is called by spiritual science, a stage such that the ego no longer applies its standard of reality to the non-ego, but finds its own reality, a new and higher reality in the non-ego. Within the whole wide sphere of what encircles man, the initiative of this stage finds his ego, that is, the higher self spoken of in inspired writings. It is a false conception to seek for the higher self in one's own inner being. There, man is left alone with himself. At best, he finds the pure ego, and he can no longer get away from himself. He may even lose himself in his egoity until he turns to the non ego. The higher self lies without, and there it is, must be sought. That is what we are told about it by the spiritual investigator. We have accordingly found 3 stages of knowledge. The ego predominates, intellectual knowledge. 2, ego and non-ego in equilibrium, imaginative knowledge. 3, the non-ego predominates, inspired knowledge. These are the 3 worlds of which spiritual science speaks. We also see from our exposition that these 3 worlds are not separated from, but lie within one another. It depends on the stage of development of the one who contemplates, which of the worlds shall reveal itself to him. We see further that in order to ascend to higher worlds, it is necessary to step completely out of oneself. This can only be achieved by the methods indicated by spiritual science. In this way, we cannot understand the immediate apperceptions of the spiritual investigator, but only when he has clothed knowledge in the forms of our understanding. That is to say, when he communicates it in the form of thoughts and doctrines, as we have already stated at the beginning of our reflections. Such a stepping out of oneself is, of course, to be distinguished from what we do when we approach the non-ego with our standard of reality derived from the ego. In order not to remain fast in the egoity, for in that case, of course, separation would be in fact persist. We certainly can understand, however, how that more theoretical passing beyond oneself may be the first prerequisite for the ascent to higher worlds, as it were. Above all, part of this that the ego shall first have truly apprehended itself. This points us back again to that part of our inquiry where we saw how the ego first attaches itself from the non-ego. Just as we see a confluence of the ego with the non-ego towards the future in the ascent of man, so too the separation of the ego must be preceded by a state in the past where ego and non-ego formed a unity. Also, in this direction we can, in a strictly analogous, analogous way, distinguish 3 stages in the relation between the 2. The first stage is that when the ego can focus itself where it is in a state of separation. The second preceding the latter is one where the relation tends to form the ego to the non-ego and vice versa, where there obtains a sort of equilibrium. The third stage, still further removed, is that where the ego itself does not as yet exist at all, and only its possibility and present in the non-ego. We can now, without more ado, call the stage in which the ego can apprehend itself the spiritual stage, where man's spirit breaks forth into the open. The stage where the relations exist reciprocally, where the ego acts on the non-ego and the non-ego on the ego, points to the soul of man. The third stage, where the ego is only potentially present, is the non-ego, as it were, is the expression for man's body. We are even in a position to give a conceptual expression to the finer transmissions. And here again, our results tally with those obtained by the spiritual investigator. In this inquiry, too, we must start from above, that is, from the point where our concepts derive. There we may call the pure ego born into pure thought, the first point of man's true spirituality. This is a germ of what in spiritual science is called spirit self, while the higher stages of knowledge are connected with the unfoldment of those members that are called life spirit and spirit man by spiritual science. Thought about thought, life in the realm of pure thought, is the precondition for the emergence of the pure ego, the spiritual spark. That sphere we may equate with what by spiritual science is called consciousness soul or spiritual soul. It furnishes the transition from the spirit, the spiritual, into man, where his ego has apprehended itself, to the psychic, where it is still bound up with the non-ego. The latter state may also be characterized as the precondition of the consciousness soul, in that man must have the capacity to think before that thought can focus itself as object. We therefore obtain the expression for the intellectual or mind soul. It denotes the state in which the ego draws its content from the non-ego. Also, for this, it once more needs a foundation, a state in which the non-ego can now penetrate to the ego, to which the name ego at this stage does not yet properly apply in order to give it its stimuli. That is denoted by the expression sentient soul. With this, we enter the sphere of the non-ego insofar as it bears within itself the precondition for an ego, that is, into the sphere of corporeity, which in spiritual science is called the sentient body. Thus, so far as the sphere of the ego extends, man's nature presents itself to us as the direct result of a theory of knowledge. That, of course, is no accident, but in truth, a guarantee that our theory of knowledge, as outlined above, attains the mark. For it is consonant with the very nature of a theory of knowledge that it should give us information about man in his relation to the world. That is to say, above all, above man's own nature. From this, it would seem to follow that we are also justified in rejecting a theory of knowledge and its objections if it does not lead to a positive result, to a real content. But the task of the theory of knowledge will by no means be fulfilled by epistemological presentments that impel us to the conclusion that man can have no objective knowledge whatever of the world, that he cannot transcend his own conceptions, that all knowledge must necessarily be subjective, and so on. Such a result is completely self-destructive. Such an assumption amounts to sawing off the bough on which one is sitting, for it is this very knowledge above which the assertion is made that it cannot lead to reality. That is made use of and presumed as valid in order to enable us to make that assertion. If all knowledge is subjective, that is, according to the usual meaning of the word, unreal, then also the knowledge that man can have no objective knowledge is surely subjective or unreal. This self-dictoriousness, however, is extremely characteristic of present-day thought and has already been shown in the above-mentioned philosophy of freedom. All such results bear the clear stamp of their origin in a materialistic way of thought, It is typical of materialistic truths that they cancel themselves. Thus, a saying that is so often used, especially as an argument against the adherence of spiritual science, is no brain, no thought. This saying is intended to express the truth that all thoughts are product of brain. In other words, subjective productions of the organism, from which it follows that thoughts are subjective in nature and can determine nothing as regards objective reality. Where materialism is less sharply defined, that statement means at least the thoughts are tied to the physical brain, so that our inquiry must start from the brain. But this very thought is made use of, and its accuracy assumed to enable one to make the statement, no brain, no thought. Okay.
Chill out. Hey, I want to see you.
Now, as you can hear, the crews got home. We're on page 18. Let me pull up a song. And we might be done. We'll have to see. Now here's an a cappella science, and it's called Choose Yourself, and it's by Emineemiun. Choose Yourself.
Oh, Hoochie.
If you had one shot, one opportunity, release all the energy you ever wanted, one moment, would you abuse it? Or use it for good? Yo, they armed with weapon, down clock and set, J. Robin up and down with sweat, eyes are red, he's nervous, cause on the surface this is Armageddon, the sharp bomb, we set upon the threat, with no sound, the whole hour go no ground, it's glowing and cloud, under one smoldering cloud, he's choking wild, everybody's open mouth, and over the ground, the sharp blood blows come out, snap back to the alchemy, hope, with old tragedy, show, with old math that we wrote, the whole anime joke, controlled action with poles, the cold gammy and coat, to cold capture the drones and slow action, we broke the phone ad, we chose to go fashion, the most radioactive, that only own gadget, then that man avoiding the nose that goes laughing, the Nagasaki is alone and Hiroshima's gas, shoot yourself out of use if the knowledge you hold, and don't ever let it go, you need to get one shot to stop it, with chance to know, responsibility goes one, science guy, you gotta shoot yourself out of use if the knowledge you hold, and don't ever let it go, you need to get one shot to stop it, with chance to know, responsibility goes one, science guy, you gotta drones escaping from the source radiating, birds just hard at him shaking, they begin to enact order, decrease order, and drop their force distorted, and supercharge that loads of protons, it can only go farther, go what goes out, their souls, their old down, the rat old to no sounding, coast to coast, outside those with the no farmer, the toe dominate, over, force happening, cold with show drama, the globe thrown, everyone knows there's no comment, so show your phone and implode your cold column, control the whole castle, bravo, but all barber, and move on to their butt toes, expose and gross notes of the emotions. Hell yes, not become a lover of a great and cosmic goal. Cannot get on these game replies. So here we go, it's a shot. Feel frail or not. This is the only world that humanity we got. You gotta shoot yourself down and use it. The now that you hold it, don't ever let it go. You only get one shot to stop it, which is to know responsibility comes once the sun's got you. Gotta shoot yourself down and use it. The now that you hold it, don't ever let it go. You only get one shot to stop it, which is to know responsibility comes once the sun's got you. Hey musical scientists, thanks for stopping by. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I made a behind the scenes video. It's right there. Please like, comment, subscribe if you'd like to help me out. If you want to help me out financially, you can buy the song. It's on iTunes. Link down there. Also, you can buy the poster that I've got on DFTBA Records now, made by my very good friend Josiah. It is there, I think. I've been keeping pretty busy. This past little while, I've been a guest vocalist on Ruben War's EP and also a song by The Electric Radio. They're both really good, so I'll put links to that in the description if you want to hear that. All right, that's it. Next time anyone sees me do a cappella science will be at Beakerhead in Calgary. It's going to be a great week of music and arts and science and craziness and nerd. So yeah, if you're around there, Calgary area, come out, say hi, talk to me. Baby, I'm Tim Blaine. This has been Acapella Science. Bye. Acapella Science.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. What talented people there are out there making music. Okay, so let's pick it back up. Spirit can only be grasped by raising oneself to it, not by drawing it down to oneself. We define the sphere of the ego, and by a train of pure reasoning, reach the non-ego from two directions. In one direction, the path led up to a sense perception. In the other, it led to supersensible intuition. It behooves us now to address ourselves to the non-ego in order to get to know the value and the epistemological significance of contemplation or perception. For the ego can only acquire a content for cognition if it passes on beyond itself to the non-ego, and first of all, to all that comes from it from the non-ego. That is generally the object of observation. If the ego stays within itself, then clearly it can only know its own reality, and may lose itself so far in egoity as to doubt all else whatsoever. And that is solipsism. Solipsism. In our conceptual inquiries, we are led right up to the boundary of the ego, which is at the boundary of the non-ego. From that point on, we may not simply go forward as from the ego, but we must seek to find the non-ego, such as it is for the non-ego. We must now recall to mind that the ego was only able to apprehend itself by having detached itself from the non-ego. Everything had to be excluded from thought that derives from the non-ego. The two concepts, ego and non-ego, came into being simultaneously. They condition each other. Thus, the same rights must accrue to the non-ego as to the ego from the moment the latter comes into being. Both must bear a kind of relationship. That, of course, is not implicit in the pure conceptual negation that lies in the expression non-ego. For horse and non-horse, for existence, need by no means be related to one another. It shows itself in this, however, that the separation of the ego from the non-ego is an actual, thoroughly real process and has been shown. This becomes still clearer if we remember that a true transition takes place from the ego to the non-ego up to the point where we found the possibility of the ego and the non-ego corporeity. Thus, it is really the non-ego that continues itself up to the point where it becomes an ego, so that the ego presents itself as part of the non-ego, if one may so say, which part detaches itself by directing itself upon itself. The ego itself withdraws itself from the non-ego and opposes itself to it as ego. Now the ego is to unite again with the non-ego, and this can come about through the ego giving back, as it were, to the non-ego what it had taken from it. This is, in the first place, pure thought. Now the next question is this: where can the ego set to work with pure thought? Where can it find the non-ego? Evidently at the highest place where the ego began to detach itself, and which, in the sense of spiritual science, we designated as sentient soul and sentient soul. At the point, we must not overlook a twofold possibility. One has already been mentioned. It is the possibility in the non-ego of an ego forming itself. The other is that now the ego will find the non-ego once more. This meeting of ego and non-ego is expressed by the term sense perception, about which spiritual science says that it comes about through the cooperation of sentient body and sentient soul, which make up a unity. From our standpoint, we can indeed see here, in a certain sense, like things are meeting from both sides. From the one side comes the ego, which has directed itself upon itself, and thereby brings to the world of pure thought up to the non-ego. That is to say, all the laws of thought that are expressed in logic. From the other side comes the sense impression. If now we would really present the non-ego that here expresses itself as it is for the non-ego, then we must say that sense impression is nothing but direction upon oneself, which, however, here proceeds from the non-ego. The sense impression surely consists precisely in this, that a part of the non-ego, the part of corporeity that we were compelled to call the finest elaboration of the non-ego, since it bears within it the possibility of an ego, can direct itself upon the whole corporeal world. Man's body, with which but slight exception is sense organ throughout its entire surface, is an apparatus wherein the world is reflected, the non-ego to which itself belongs. Man's body can never reflect itself within itself, yielding thereby the best expression for the peculiar reflexive process of the non-ego. But its very sensory activity, it provides the possibility of the ego being kindled in thought. Thus, in sensory activity too, we have something that exists itself, and therefore we see the standard for reality that derives from the ego applied to the non-ego. Thus, accordingly, we have the meeting of like minds, since both factors come about through a kind of reflexive activity. On the one side, pure thought; on the other, pure perception. The fact that here, indeed, like things do meet, can also be made clear to us by means of the following considerations, which may be said to furnish a test for the foregoing thoughts. Sense perception surveys the whole fullness of the world of sense. For naive sense perception there appear in its so-called sense objects. In that view, however, the fact is disregarded that each object represents a certain sum of individual sensory quanta that are first brought into a unity by thought. Now, so soon as thought consciously immerses itself in the world of sense, the objects are dissolved, as it were, into individual sense perceptions, such as red, bright, warm, loud, fine, firm, etc. Now, if pure thought further probes the nature of these phenomenal forms of the non ego, it finds that all these sensory qualities, and therewith also the objects composed of them, are nothing else but concepts, which, however, are given in quite a different way from the concepts created by the ego and thought. While thought, or rather the individual concepts themselves, do not of themselves denote reality, but only when comprehended in the pure ego, we now find these same concepts given from the side of the non-ego in a way quite independent of the ego, precisely by pure perception. Such concepts, therefore, which the ego not merely creates out of the sum of all conceptual possibility, but finds again in percepts, are the real objects, or generally the realities of the non-ego. When pure thought and pure perception meet together, ego and non-ego can reunite, and the result is cognition. With this, we have found the epistemological significance of perception. The pathway to knowledge, here only sketched in broad outline, is actually applied in all natural research where it keeps strictly within its province, and we find that process to be something belonging to all the workings of nature. Both the growth of man to the ego and the knowledge of nature are alike processes that have a great significance in cosmic happening, and we may look with awe on nature's working, whose shaping forces create the precondition for the ego. We may also direct with awe the pure thoughts given by us, nature's working upon pure sensory experience. This awe is needed in order rightly to carry on the process of world becoming through knowledge of nature. That awe consists in a recognition of the fact that we ourselves are only part of the great becoming, that we as ego must feel ourselves to be part of the non-ego, that the things surrounded us are our fellows, that in their own way they are beings like ourselves. Then our striving after knowledge becomes a searching by our spirit, our ego, for the spirit, the ego of things. Herein we have the one side of the relations between ego and non-ego that leads to the sense perception and so to natural knowledge. It is the side where the ego applies its standard of reality to the non-ego. Now there is yet another side which leads to the higher ego receiving its reality from the non-ego. This is the path to initiation or to supersensible perception, that is to say, to a higher knowledge and reality. In principle, nothing, of course, is changed in the concept of perception as developed above, whether we are dealing with sensible or supersensible perception. That this second side is of the utmost importance becomes clear to us from the fact that knowledge of nature, while it creates a balance as between ego and non-ego, does so only as a stage on the way back to complete union. In knowledge, the ego indeed gives back, as it were, pure thought to nature, but it retains for itself its own living being. It remains to itself, severed from the non-ego. Hence, too, is that the knowledge of pure thought also appears to us as something cold and hostile to life. Warmth and life come to this knowledge from the feeling and certainty that the stage of pure thought signifies only the first step to a true union with the non-ego. It cannot here be our task to describe the path to the higher worlds, but we only want to point out, on a strength of epistemological considerations, that such a path to higher knowledge does exist. It is true that such a path at the beginning points to a sacrifice that the ego has to make. At the same time, we also find as our goal the attainment of a new and higher self that lies in the non-ego. Through initiation, man apprehends the world from within out. He penetrates forward to the shaping forces that are hidden in the works of nature, to the ego of all nature. This is the mighty perspective that opens before us when we carry the theory of knowledge rightly to its conclusion. Also, in this unfoldment of the new and higher ego, we have a process enacted in the non-ego. But while the parallel process in the working of the senses is accomplished by the shaping forces of existence without help of man, this second process must be brought about by man himself. There, man attains to a real creative share in the world process. This comes about by a sacrifice of the lower self. But that sacrifice is only an answer made by man to the sacrifice made by the shaping forces of existence when man was created with his ego. Through initiation, man gives back again to the ruling powers what they sacrificed in order to produce him. After all, we have reflected upon, it should not be hard for us to grasp this thought. For our whole theory of knowledge leads us to apprehend the severance of the ego from the non-ego as a spiritual process. That is to say, as a process behind which there are conscious forces. For otherwise, no consciousness could form itself as a result of this process. But the ego is spirit and consciousness and reality, and it bodies itself forth out of the total consciousness of the non-ego. The path to higher knowledge is pointed out to us by spiritual science. From higher worlds it brings down to mankind what shall enable it in the future to accomplish this unfoldment of the higher ego. When we have made ourselves familiar with the idea that in the case of the higher worlds we are not dealing with something abstract, but with powers and beings that stand above man and of whose spirit the human ego is a spark, then we can understand what with the principle of the ego unfoldment we have apprehended a world principle of development. 3 times we saw how something higher is shaped when a force directs itself upon itself. The non-ego, which in sensory activity directs itself upon itself, is, as it were, the first unfoldment of the ego. From this arises pure perception, and therewith the possibility for the human ego to be kindled. The second unfoldment of the ego is in thought above thought. Thirdly, the pure ego offers the possibility that the higher self may be formed by the ego, giving back of itself to the non-ego all the spirituality that it had taken from it. If we may presuppose this capacity in man today, we must yet admit to ourselves that this capacity was once conferred on mankind from higher worlds by superhuman beings and without going beyond outward. Historical facts, we can point to the moment in time when this happened. If we compare the conditions of our own culture and consciousness with those of the pre-Christian civilizations, we can see how the emergence of intellectual self-consciousness, of independence, of individualism makes itself gradually felt out of the earlier group consciousness of national homogeneousness, homogeneousness. The mightiest ego unfoldment, we can say, lies at this turning point of man's development, and we can struggle through to the admission that it is based in truth to say what in the beginning was with God, out of which all that was ever made was made, became flesh at the beginning of our era, when the spirit of mankind, out of which the growth to the ego unfolded, directed itself upon itself. Through this, there arose the higher self of all mankind as the Christ Spirit, who gave the first impulse so that it became possible for the individual man, through his own free sacrificial gift, to hand on the great, the mighty sacrifice. This is described for us by spiritual science, and it may spur us on the way it points to, if we are able, from out of the self-apprehension of our spirit, to develop the ideas that lead us to an understanding of these lofty doctrines. That concludes chapter 1. So when we pick up again with this subject, we will be talking about natural science and spiritual science. And until then, may the peace that passes all understanding be in your hearts and minds, and keep Christ at the forefront of your experience. Talk soon. Peace out.